Stolen Cure Dilemma. Imagine the sound of the world holding its breath, not in anticipation, but in desperation. A collective, rasping gasp from 8 billion souls teetering on the edge of a biological abyss. This was the reality of the Crimson Scourge. It wasn't a disease that simply killed, it unraveled you. It began with a fever, a telltale crimson blush across the skin, but it ended in a catastrophic failure of the body's most basic functions, turning vibrant life into a husk of its former self. Hospitals weren't just full, they were monuments to failure, steel and glass cathedrals where the only prayer was for a quick end. Governments had collapsed, economies had evaporated, and the thin veneer of civilization was peeling back to reveal the raw, terrified animal beneath. Hope was the most expensive commodity on the planet, and it was a currency no one had. No one, that is, except for Dr. Aris Thorne. Thorne was not a hero in the traditional sense. He wasn't a charismatic leader or a stoic soldier. He was a man of quiet rooms and humming machines, of data streams and genetic sequencing. For a decade, he had waged a silent war against the scourge from within the sterile confines of his subterranean laboratory. He had sacrificed everything: his family, his friendships, his own health, all for a single elusive goal: a cure. He had chased down thousands of dead ends, watched promising compounds fail spectacularly, and felt the crushing weight of every new death toll announced on the emergency broadcasts. He was brilliant, yes, but he was also exhausted, haunted by the ghosts of his failures, and driven by a desperate, almost fanatical need to succeed. And then, against all odds, he found it. A breakthrough, not in a petri dish, not in a complex synthetic molecule, but in the blood of a single human being. Her name was Eleanor Vance. She was 87 years old, a former librarian who could quote poetry by heart and remembered a world before the scourge, a world of crowded parks and casual hugs. She was also in the final stages of the disease, but her body was doing something impossible, something no one else has had. It was fighting back. Deep within her failing system, a unique set of antibodies had spontaneously formed, a perfect, adaptive, self-replicating key to lock the Crimson Scourge out of the human body forever. It was a 1 in 8 billion miracle, a biological lottery winner. The cure wasn't a formula he could write down. It was a living, evolving system that resided only within her. And therein lay the truly monstrous nature of his dilemma. The miracle came with a terrifying catch. The antibody cluster was intrinsically linked to Eleanor's life force. It was so potent, so aggressive in its fight, that it could only be harvested as a whole, living system. The moment her natural life function ceased, the moment her heart stopped on its own, the system would destabilize and decay into useless proteins within seconds. It would be like trying to capture lightning in a bottle after the flash is already faded. The cure would be lost forever. The only way to preserve the living antibody cluster, to capture it in a state where it could be replicated and synthesized into a global cure, was to extract it while her body was still technically alive. The process of extraction, a complex bioharvesting procedure, would be instantly fatal. He couldn't wait for her to die. To get the cure, he had to be the direct cause of her death. This was the equation sitting on the desk of his soul. The life of Eleanor Vance on one side, and the lives of every other man, woman, and child on the planet on the other. It was the trolley problem, magnified to a global scale. But Thorne wasn't a bystander choosing who to run over. He would have to be the one to physically push the victim onto the tracks. He sat by her bedside for days, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, each breath a tick of the doomsday clock. He learned about her life from the worn photographs on her nightstand, a smiling husband, long gone, children, grandchildren whose fates were now unknown. He read her chart. He saw a person, a life lived, a story nearing its end. And he was being asked to tear out the final page himself. The pressure from what was left of the world's leadership was immense. They called it a necessary sacrifice, a painful but logical choice. They spoke of the greater good, of historical precedent, of the cold arithmetic of survival. To them, Eleanor Vance was already gone, a tragic but acceptable cost. But for Thorne, who had to look into her peaceful, dying face, it was anything but simple. He was staring into the ethical abyss, and the abyss was staring back, asking him a question no human should ever have to answer. Let one woman die a natural death and condemn billions to the scourge, or commit a quiet, clinical murder to give humanity a future. The weight of the world wasn't on his shoulders, it was on his conscience, poised on the tip of a single sterile needle.
Block 2. The Unforgivable Act. The room was a vacuum of sound, broken only by the soft, rhythmic sigh of the ventilator and the steady, almost mocking beep of the heart monitor. Each beep was a metronome, counting down the final moments of Eleanor Vance's life, and with it, humanity's last chance. For Aris Thorne, that sound was a form of torture. It was the sound of his own indecision, his own moral paralysis. He stood over her, the tools for the procedure laid out on a sterile tray beside him. They gleamed under the cold, white light of the medical bay, looking less like instruments of healing and more like the implements of a ritual sacrifice. He could feel the eyes of the world on him, even here in this isolated chamber. He could hear the desperate pleas of a dying species in the hum of the air recyclers. His mind was a battlefield. One part, the scientist, the pragmatist, screamed at him with cold, irrefutable logic. It showed him charts, mortality projections, the exponential spread of the Crimson Scourge. It laid out the utilitarian calculus in stark, brutal terms. One life, already fading, versus billions. It was a simple mathematical truth. To hesitate was to be complicit in global extinction. This part of him saw Eleanor not as a person, but as a vessel, a biological treasure chest that had to be unlocked before it was buried forever. It whispered that history wouldn't judge the method, only the result. Salvation has a price, it argued, and today you are the one who has to pay it. It was the voice of reason, the voice of survival. But another part of him, the human part, was recoiling in horror. This voice didn't speak in numbers, it spoke in images. It showed him his own hands, the hands of a healer, a creator, now poised to become the hands of a killer. It reminded him of the Hippocratic oath he had taken, a promise to do no harm. It forced him to look at Eleanor's face, at the fine web of wrinkles around her closed eyes, each one a map of a life filled with laughter and tears, love and loss. This voice screamed that some lines should never be crossed, that the sanctity of a single life is an absolute, not a variable in an equation. To murder for the greater good was to poison the very future he was trying to save. How could humanity rebuild itself on a foundation of cold-blooded murder? He watched the monitor. Her vitals were dropping, slowly but irreversibly. The window was closing. He saw flashes of the world outside, a news clip of a child crying in a makeshift quarantine camp, a soldier in a hazmat suit dragging a body from a home, the empty, desolate streets of a once bustling city. The screams of the dying were louder than the protests of his own conscience. He picked up the extraction syringe. It felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the moral gravity of his choice. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer, monumental significance of the act. He was about to play God, to extinguish one light in the hopes of reigniting billions of others. He leaned over Eleanor. For a moment, her eyelids fluttered. He froze, his heart seizing in his chest. Did she know? Could she feel the presence of her executioner? But her eyes remained closed. It was just an involuntary flicker, a final, fading echo of her nervous system. With a deep, shuddering breath, he steadied his hand. He whispered, to her, to himself, to whatever might be listening, "I'm sorry." And then he did it. He administered the sedative to ensure there was no pain, and then he began the procedure. The clinical, precise movements of his hands were a stark contrast to the storm raging within him. He watched the monitor as he worked. The steady, rhythmic beep faltered. It became erratic, then slowed, and then it stopped. A long, unbroken, horizontal line. In the deafening silence that followed, there was no sense of triumph, no relief. Only the cold, heavy finality of what he had done. Eleanor Vance was gone, and in her place, on the sterile tray, was a single, glowing vial. The swirling, luminescent liquid within was the hope of the world. It was salvation. It was the future. But as Thorne looked at it, all he could see was the price. He had saved humanity, but he had lost his own. The silence of the room was his immediate judgment, the first moment of a lifelong sentence. He was no longer just Dr. Aris Thorne, the brilliant scientist. He was Thorne, the savior. Thorne, the murderer. The man who held the cure for the world, but would never be able to cure the wound he had just inflicted upon his own soul.
Block 3. Global Cure. Moral Cost. The cure worked. It worked with an efficacy that was nothing short of miraculous. The luminescent liquid from that single vial, synthesized and mass-produced with astonishing speed, was like a rising tide, washing away the crimson stain from the face of the earth. Within months, the pandemic that had brought civilization to its knees began to recede. The sounds of coughing and sirens were slowly replaced by the sounds of recovery, of children laughing in reclaimed parks, of shops reopening, of people tentatively embracing loved ones for the first time in years. Humanity had stared into the abyss, and, thanks to Dr. Aris Thorne, it had not blinked. He was a hero. His face was on every screen, his name taught in every school. He was the man who had single-handedly saved the world. And then the truth came out. It wasn't a leak or an investigation that exposed him. It was Thorne himself. Unable to live as a celebrated icon while privately haunted by the ghost of Eleanor Vance, he made a full public confession. He detailed the science, the impossible choice, and the final terrible moments in that sterile room. He spared no detail, laying his soul bare for the world he had saved to judge. And that world, once united in its gratitude, fractured instantly and violently. The debate was not academic. It was a visceral, global argument that raged in every household. Was Dr. Aris Thorne a savior or a monster? The question became the defining moral crisis of the new era. On one side, the utilitarians championed him. They were the pragmatists, the survivors, the ones who had seen the worst of the scourge and understood the stakes. To them, Thorne's choice wasn't just justifiable, it was heroic. They pointed to the philosophy of John Stuart Mill, arguing that the moral worth of an action is determined solely by its contribution to overall utility, its ability to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. One life versus billions? The math isn't just simple, it's the only math that matters. They argued that to cling to an abstract moral principle like "do not kill" in the face of extinction is a form of suicidal vanity. Thorne, they claimed, was the only one with the courage to make the hard choice, to dirty his hands so that the rest of humanity could remain clean. Statues were erected in his honor, depicting him not as a scientist, but as a modern atlas, bearing the moral weight of the world on his shoulders. Opposing them were the deontologists, the absolutists. They argued from a position of inviolable rights and duties, echoing thinkers like Immanuel Kant. For them, the consequences of an action are irrelevant to its moral worth. An act is either right or wrong, full stop. Murder is wrong. It doesn't become right just because it leads to a positive outcome. They argued that by sacrificing Eleanor Vance, Thorne hadn't just killed one person. He had shattered the fundamental principle that every individual life has intrinsic, incalculable value. He saved the species, but sacrificed its soul. What kind of world had he saved, they asked, if it was one where a person could be reduced to a mere resource, their life forfeit for the convenience of the majority? They called for him to be tried for murder, arguing that to let him go unpunished would set a terrifying precedent, the Thorne principle, that the powerful could sacrifice the weak for the greater good whenever it suited them. The world Thorne saved was now a world at war with itself over its own salvation. He was put on trial, a global spectacle that was less about law and more about the soul-searching of a species. He sat in the courtroom, a quiet, broken man, listening as the world debated his fate. He offered no defense, accepting whatever judgment was passed. In the end, the verdict was as divided as public opinion. He was found guilty of murder, but his sentence was immediately commuted in light of the unprecedented circumstances. He was simultaneously a convicted killer and a pardoned savior, a living paradox. He was allowed to live out his days in quiet seclusion, a pariah to some, a saint to others. His story became a permanent part of our culture, a chilling fable for a new age. It forced us to confront the most difficult questions about ourselves. What are we willing to do to survive? Is there a point where the cost of survival becomes too high? Aris Thorne made his choice. He traded one life for billions, and his own peace of mind for the future of humanity. He waited for her to die. Then he stole the cure. Now we are left with the enduring, haunting question that will echo through the generations he saved. Was it worth it? And perhaps more importantly, as you sit there, safe and alive because of what he did, what would you have done?